To have seen a specter isn't everything, and there are death masks piled, one atop the other, clear to heaven. Commoner still are the wan visages of those returning from the shadow of the valley. This means little to those who've not lifted the veil. The ward nurse cautioned me not to excite her. How can one prevent that? And I was allowed only a few minutes. The head nurse also stopped me to say I was permitted to see her just because she always called my name and I must cheer her. She had had a very near brush and was not rallying properly, actually was in marked decline, and still in much danger. Quite impressed to my duties, I entered and gazed down on her slender form resting so quietly on the high white bed. Her pale face was whiter, like chalk. It was pathetically clear how utterly weak she was. There seemed absolutely no blood left in her body. I stared and stared. She didn't breathe, didn't move. I would never have recognized her. She was a waxed mummy. White is the absence of all color. She was white, all white. Unless beneath the covers, whose top caressed her breasts, was still hidden a speck of pink. The thin ivory arms tapered inward until they reached the slight outward bulge of narrow palms, and the hands in turn bent inward with a more sharp taper, only to quickly end in long fingers curled to a point. These things, and her head with its completely matted hair so black and contrasting with all the whiteness, were the only parts of her visible. Quite normal, I know, but I just couldn't get over how awfully dead she looked. I had so arranged my head above hers that when her eyes opened, after about 10 minutes, they were in direct line with mine. They showed no surprise, nor changed their position in the slightest. The faintest of smiles, the merest of voices. "Hello." I placed my hand on her arm. It was all I could do to restrain myself from jumping on the bed to hold her. I saw she was too weak to talk, and told her not to. I, however, rambled on at a great rate. There was no doubt she was overjoyed to see me. Her eyes said so. It was as though the gesture of self-destruction had, in her mind, equalized all the guilt. The courage of committing the act seemed to have justified her to herself. This action on her conviction, no matter how neurotic, had called for all her strength, and she was now released. Free from the urge, since the will for death needs a strong concentration of pressure to fulfill itself, and once accomplished via attempt, it's defeated until another period of build-up is gone through. Unless, of course, one succeeds in reaching death the first shot, or is really mad. Gazing down on her with a grin of artificial buoyancy, I sensed this and felt an instant flood of envy. She had escaped, at least for some time, and I knew I had yet to make my move. Being a coward, I had postponed too long, and I realized I was further away from commitment than ever. Would hesitancy never end? She shifted her cramped hand. I looked down, and for the first time noticed the tight sheet covering a flat belly. It was empty, sunken. She had lost her baby. For a moment I wondered if she knew it, then thought she must know. Even now she was almost touching her stomach, and she'd been in the hospital 10 days. Surely a stupid idea. I resolved to think better. The nurse glided up and said I'd better go. Promising to return the next day, I leaned over and kissed Joan's clear forehead and left. Off to the pool hall, back to the old grind. I seemed to have a mania. From the way I loafed there all day, one would scarcely believe I'd never been in a pool hall 2 short years before. Why, less than 6 months ago, I still couldn't bear to play more than 1 game at a time. Well, what is one to say about things he has done? I never again went back to the hospital to bless Joan. Oh, that's what I felt like, blessing her. Each day I lacerated myself thinking on her, but I didn't go back. Sometimes I sits and thinks, Other times I sits and drinks, but mostly I just sits. I must have been in a pretty bad way. Anyhow, 2 more weeks went by in this fashion. My inability to stir from my pool hall prison became a joke, even to me. It was the night before Christmas, about 5 p.m., when a handsome woman near 40 came inside the gambling jail's gates and asked for me. I went up front to meet her. As I came closer, I saw she was better than handsome, a real good looker, and despite her age, making quite a stir among the boys. She introduced herself, said she was a friend of Joan, and invited me to dinner. My heart bounced with guilty joy. I accepted, and we walked the 5 blocks to this fine, though 40, ladies' apartment without talking. The fatherly taxi driver opened the door. My hostess said it was her husband, and that Joan would be out in a minute. Preparations for a huge dinner were in the making. I sat on the sofa and waited. The bathroom, ugly word, door swung out, and before my eyes was once again the gorgeous Joan, second of Jennifer Jones. Fresh from the shower, mirror-primped, stepped my heroine, resplendent in her new friend's housecoat. Just when you think you've learned your lesson and swear to watch your step, a single moment off guard will pop up and hope springs high as ever. One startled look and I knew I was right back where I started. I felt again that choking surge flooding me as when first I'd seen her. I started talking to myself, determined to whip the pool hall rut and drag my stinking ass out of the hole. Over the prosperous supper, on which we soon pounced, hung an air of excitement. Joan and I were leaping with love looks across the roast beef, while cabby and wife beamed on us. And we planned, yes, sir, all 4 of us, and right out loud, too. I was kind of embarrassed at first when the host began without preamble. "All right, you kids have wasted enough time. I see you love each other, and you're gonna settle down right now. In the morning, Joan is starting at St. Luke's as a student nurse. She's told me that's what she would like to do. As for you, Neal, if you're serious, I'll get up a little early tomorrow, and before I go to work, we'll see if my boss will give you a job. If you can't get away with telling him you're 21, the law says you gotta be 21. You're not that old yet, are you?" I said no. "So that you can drive taxi, you can probably get a job servicing the cabs. That okay with you?" I said certainly it was, and thanked him, and everybody laughed and was happy. It was further decided that Joan and I stay with them until we got our first paycheck. We could sleep on the couch that opened out into a bed. Gorged with the big meal, I retired to the bathroom as the women did the dishes and the old man read the paper. By golly, it seems everything I write about happens in a bathroom. Don't think I'm hung up that way, it's just the incidents exactly as they occurred. And here's another one, because... A knock on the toilet door, and I rose to let in my resurrected beauty. She was as coy as ever, but removed was much fear and embarrassment. We did a bit of smooching. Then, seated on the edge of the tub, she asked if I wanted to see her scar. I kneeled before her to observe better as she parted the bathrobe to reveal an ugly red wound, livid against her buttermilk belly, stretching nearly from navel to clitoris. She was worried I wouldn't think her as beautiful, or love her as much now that her body had been marred by the surgeon's knife performing a cesarean. There might have been a partial hysterectomy, too, and she fretted that the production of more babies, when we get the money, would prove difficult. I reassured her on all counts, swore my love, and meant it, and finally we returned to the living room. Oh, unhappy mind! Trickster! Oh, fatal practicality! I was wearing really filthy clothes, but had a change promised me by a friend who lived at 12th and Ogden Streets, so as not to hang up my dwarf cabby savior when we went to see his buddy boss next AM. My foolish head thought to make a speed run and get the necessary clean impediments now. Acting on this obvious need, if I was to impress my hoped-for employer into hiring me, I promised to hurry back and left. Where is wisdom? Joan offered to walk with me, and I turned down the suggestion, reasoning it was very cold and I could make better time alone. Besides, she was still pretty weak, and if she was to work tomorrow, the strain of the fairly long walk might prove too much. No sense jeopardizing her health. Would that I'd made her walk with me. Would that she'd collapsed rather than let me go alone. Would anything instead of what happened. Not only did the new promise for happiness go down the drain, and I lost Joan forever, but her peace was to evaporate once and for all, and she herself was to sink into the iniquity reserved for a certain type of beaten women. I rushed my trip to the clothes depot, made good connections, and was quickly on my way back to the warm apartment and my Joan. The route from 12th and Ogden to 16th and Lincoln Streets lies for the most part, if one so desires, along East Colfax Ave. Horrible mistake. Stupid moment. I chose that path just to dig people on the crowded thoroughfares. I hustled by them, and mid-block between Pennsylvania and Pearl Streets is a tavern whose plate glass front ill conceals the patrons of its booths. I was almost past this bar when I glanced up to see my younger blood brother inside drinking beer alone. I had made good time, and the hard habit of lushing that I was then addicted to pushed me through the door to bum a quickie off him. Surprise, surprise, he was loaded with loot, and more surprising, gushed all over me. He ordered as fast as I could drink, and I didn't let the waitress stop, finishing the glass in a gulp. One draft for the first few, then two for the next several, and so on until I was sipping normally by the time an hour had fled. First off, he wanted a phone number, the reason for his generosity, I suspect, and I was the only one who could give it to him. He claimed to have been sitting there actually brooding over the very girl on the other end of this phone number, and I believed him. Had to take it true, because for the last 5 months it had become increasingly clear that he was hot as hell for this chick, who was my girl. I gave him the number, and he dashed from one booth to the other. I had cautioned him not to mention my name, nor to tell her I was there, and he said he wouldn't. But he did, although he denied it later. The reason for his disloyalty, despite the fact it cost me Joan, was justifiable, since as one might when about to be denied a date of importance while drinking, he had used my whereabouts as a last-ditch lure to tempt her out. He came back to the booth from the phone booth, crestfallen. She had said she couldn't leave the house just now, but to call her back in a half hour or so. This didn't cheer him, as it would have me. He's richer and less easily satisfied. He called her again. About 45 minutes after I'd first been pulled into the dive by my powerful thirst, and she said for him to wait at this joint and she'd be down within an hour. This length of time didn't seem unreasonable. She lived quite a ways further out in East Denver. I thought everything was going perfectly. Bill got the girl, I got my drinks, and still had a short period of grace in which to slop up more before she showed. I certainly didn't intend to be there when she arrived. And I'd only be a little late returning to Joan, where I'd plead hassle in getting the clothes. Oh, sad shock. Oh, unpleasant time. Had I just not guzzled that last beer, all the following would not be written, and I could end this story with, "And they lived happily ever after." Whoa. Read slowly for a bit and have patience with my verbosity. There are two things I've got to say here. One is a side point, and it'll come second. The first is essential to the understanding of this story. So, I got to give you one of my Hollywood flashbacks. I'll leave out the most of it and be as brief as possible to make it tight, although by the nature of it this will be hard, especially since I'm tired. Number 1. On June 23, 1945, I was released from New Mexico State Reformatory after doing 11 months and 10 days. Know the song? Of hard labor. Soon after returning to Denver, I had the rare luck to meet a 16-year-old East High beauty who had well-to-do parents, mother, and pretty older sister to be exact. Cherry Mary, Mary Ann Fairland, was her name, because she lived on Cherry Street and was a cherry when I met her. That condition didn't last long. I ripped into her like a maniac, and she loved it. A tremendous affair, countless things to be said about it. I can hardly help from blurting out 20 or 30 statements right now, despite resolution to condense. I'm firm, and won't tell the story of our 5 months' intercourse, with its many incidents that are percolating this moment in my brain about carnival night we met Ellich's, the hundreds of mountain trips in her new Mercury, rented trucks with a mattress in back, at her cabins I broke into, day I got her to bang Hal Chase, time I gave her clap after momentous meeting between her and mother of my second child, only boy before Diana's, time I knocked her up, and knocked it. Mad nights and early AMs at Goodyear factory, I worked alone in from 4 p.m. to any time I wanted to go home, doing it on golf courses, roofs, parks, cemeteries, dead people's homes, snowbanks, schools and schoolyards, hotel bathrooms, her mother's vacant houses. She was a realtor, doing it every way we could think of, any old place we happened to be. In fact, we did it so many places that Denver was covered with our pecker tracks. So many different ones that I can't possibly remember. Often we'd trek clear from one side of town to another just to find a spot to drop to it. On ordinary occasions, I'd just pull it out and shove. To her bottom if we were secluded, to her mouth if not. The greatest, most humorous incident of the lot. To please her mother, she'd often babysit for some of their socially prominent and wealthy friends several times a week. I drove out to that particular evening's assignment after she called to give the address and say the coast was clear. Funny English joke. Man and wife in living room. Phone rings. Man answers and says he wouldn't know. Better call the Coast Guard. And hangs up. Wife says, "Who was it, dear?" And man says, "I don't know. Some damn fool wanted to know if the coast was clear." Har, har, har. And we quickly tear off several goodies. Then I go back to work. In Goodyear truck, don't you know? We'd done this numerous times when the most humorous evening came up. It was a Sunday night, so no work. I waited outside 16th and High Street apartment till parents left, and then went in and fell to it. I had all my clothes off, and in living room, as she was washing my cock in bathroom. Let this be a lesson to you men. Never become separated from your clothes. At least keep your trousers handy when doing this sort of thing in a strange house. Oops. My goodness, I forgot for a second that some of you are out of circulation, and certainly not in any need of Lord Chesterfield's counseling. Don't show this to your wives. Or tell them that I only offer this advice to pass on to your sons. Or if that's too harsh, to your dilettante friends. Phew, got out of that. There's a rattling of the apartment door, and into the front room walks the mother of one of the parents of the baby Cherry Mary is watching. So fast did this old bat come in that we barely had time to shut the bathroom door before she saw us. Here I was, nude, no clothes, and all exits blocked. I couldn't stay there, for what if the old gal wanted to pee? And most old women's bladders and kidneys are not the best in the world. There was no place in the bathroom to hide, nor could I sneak out due to the layout of the apartment. Worse, Mary suddenly remembered the fact that this intruder was expected to stay the night. We consulted in whispers, laughing and giggling despite all, and it was decided Mary would leave the bathroom and keep the old lady busy while suggesting a walk or coffee down the street and still try to collect my clothes and get them to me. No mean feat. My task was to, as quietly as a mouse, remove all the years-long collection of rich people's bath knickknacks that blocked the room's only window. Then, impossible though it looked, I must climb up the tub to it, and with a fingernail file pry loose the outside screen. Now, look at this window. It had 4 panes of glass, 6 inches long and 4 inches wide. It formed a rectangle of about 12 or 13 inches high and 8 or 9 inches across. Difficult to squeeze through at best. But being modern as hell, the way it was hooked to its frame was by a single metal bar in direct center, which when opened split the panes of glass down the middle and made 2 windows. I could hardly reach outside to work on the screen since the window opened outward, but I pushed, and making a hell of a noise split the screen enough to open the window. Now the impossible compressing of my frame for the squeeze. I thought if I could get my head through, I could make it. I was just able to, by bending the tough metal bar the slightest contour. In those days, I cleaned and jerked 220 pounds. And of course, I almost tore off my pride and joy as I wiggled out into the cold November air. I was damn glad I was only on the 2nd floor. If I'd been higher, I would have been hung up in space for sure. So I dropped into the bushes bordering the walk along the side of the building and hid there, shivering and gloating with glee. There was a film of snow on the ground, but this didn't bother anything except my feet, until some man parked his car in the alley garage and came walking past my hideaway. Then much of my naked body got wet as I pressed against the icy ground so he wouldn't see me. This made me seek better shelter, since it was about 9 p.m. I'd been in the cold an hour, and a whole string of rich bastards with cars might start putting them away. I waited until no one was in sight, then dashed down the walk to the alley and leaped up and grabbed the handy drain pipe of a garage and pulled myself up. The window I'd broken out of overlooked my new refuge, and if anyone went in that bathroom, they'd see the havoc wrought the place and be looking out to see me. This fear just formed. I was too cold to be jolly now, when I saw Mary at last come into view. She had my pants, shoes, and coat, but not my t-shirt and socks, having skipped these small items as she bustled about in front of the cause of my predicament, straightening up. The woman had only noticed my belt, and Mary had said she had a leather class at school and was engraving it. When I'd bashed out the window, Mary had heard the crashing about. The old lady must have been deaf. While I was escaping, kept talking about Thanksgiving turkey, and had come into the bathroom to clean up, close the window, and otherwise cover up. I put on my clothes, and chattering uncontrollably from my freeze-out, walked with Mary to the Oasis Cafe for some hot coffee. And so it goes, tale after tale revolving around this Cherry Mary period. Here's just a couple more. At first, the mother of this frantic fucking filly confided in me, and to get me on her side, asked me to take care of Mary, watch her, and so forth. After a while, as Mary got wilder, the old bitch decided to give me a dressing down. I can't remember the exact little thing that led up to this, offhand anyhow. And since she wasn't the type to do it herself, and to impress me, I guess, she got the pastor of the parish to give me a lecture. Now, her home was in one of the elite parishes, and so she got the Monsignor, it was a Catholic church, to come over for dinner the same evening she invited me. I arrived a little before him, and could at once smell something was cooking. The slut just couldn't hold back her little scheme, told Mary to listen closely, and began preaching a little of her own gospel to warm me up for the main event. The doorbell rang, and her eyes sparkled with anticipation as she sallied forth from the kitchen to answer it. The priest was a middle-sized, middle-aged, pink-featured man with extremely thick glasses, covering such poor eyes he couldn't see me until our noses almost touched. Coming toward me, across the palatial living room, he had his handshake extended and was in the midst of a normal greeting, the mother escorting him by the elbow all the while and gushing introduction. Then it happened. He saw me. What an expression! I've never seen a chin drop so far, so fast it literally banged his breastbone. "Neal! Neal! My boy! At last I've found my boy!" His voice broke as he said the last word, and his Adam's apple refused to articulate further, because all it gave out was a strangled blubber. Choking with emotion, he violently clasped me to him and flung his eyes to heaven, fervently thanking his God. Tremendous tears rolled down his cheeks, poured over his upthrust jaw, and disappeared inside his tight clerical collar. I had trouble deciding whether to leave my arms hanging limp or throw them around him and try to return the depth of his goodness by turning to it. Golly and woo-wee! What a sight! The priest's emotion had been one of incredulous, joyous recognition. Mary's mother's emotion was a gem of frustrated surprise. Startled wonder at such an unimaginable happening left her gaping at us with the most foolish-looking face I've ever seen. She didn't know whether to faint or flee. Never had she been so taken aback, and I'm sure didn't think she ever would be. It was really a perfect farce. Mary and her sister, who was there to lend dignity to her mother's idea, were as slack-jawed as any of us. Depend on sweet Mary to recover first. She did, with a giggle, which her sister took as a cue to frown upon, thereby regaining her senses. The mother's composure came with a gasp of artificial goo. "Well, what a pleasant surprise!" she gurgled with strained smile, feeling lucky that she'd snuck out from under so easily. Ho, ho, ho! But wait! Aha! She'd made a mistake! Her tension was so unbearable, and she had succeeded so well with her first words that she decided to speak again. "Let's all go into supper, shall we?" she said in a high-pitched, nervous urge. The false earnestness of her tone struck us all as a most incongruous concern, and she'd given herself away by being too quick, since her guest was still holding me tightly. The ecstatic priest was Harlan Fisher, my godfather when I was baptized at age 10 in 1936. He had also taught me Latin for some months, and saw me occasionally during the following 3 years I served at Holy Ghost Church as altar boy. At our last meeting I was engrossed in the lives of the saints, and determined to become a priest or Christian brother. Then I abruptly disappeared down the pleasanter path of evil. Now, 6.5 years later, he met me again in Mary's house as a youth he'd come to lecture. Well, he didn't get around to the lecture. It never seemed to enter his head because it was too full of blissful joy at finding his lost son. He told me how he'd never had another godson. It just so happened that way. And how he'd prayed night and day for my soul and to see me again. He could hardly contain himself at the dinner table, fidgeted and twittered and didn't touch his food. He dragged the whole story of the long wait for this moment out into the open, and before the sullen-hearted, she gave me piercing glances of pure hate when Father Fisher wasn't looking. Mother actually waxed moistly eloquent. When the meal was over, the dirty old bitch knew her sweet little scheme had backfired completely, for Fisher at once excused himself, saying he was sure everyone understood, because he wanted to talk to me alone. And we left. We drove to his church, and then sat in his car for 2 hours, before I got out and walked away, never to see him to this very day, now 5 years since. He started in with the old stuff, and I, knowing there could be no agreement, not wanting to use him unfairly, came down right away, and for once I didn't hesitate as I told him not to bother. I was sorry for it. But we were worlds apart, and it would now do no good for him to try and come closer. Oh, we did a lot of talking. It wasn't quite that short and simple. But as I say, I finally left him when he realized there was nothing more to be said, and that was that. The other incident I wanted to tell you about can wait. I must cut this to the bone from here on out because I haven't the money for paper. Anyhow, the reason for this little glimpse into the months just prior to meeting Joan was to show there was some cause for what happened to me in the bar with my younger blood brother. Mind you, I hadn't seen Mary's mother for at least a month before this night in the bar, although I'd seen Mary about 2 weeks earlier. Oh, what's another few lines? I gotta break in here and tell you that other funny little thing about C. Mary. It is this. She was such a hypochondriac that she often played at blindness. Now wait a minute, this was unusual because she never complained of illness or anything else. In fact, she didn't complain about her eyes either, just the opposite. She played at having a true martyr complex toward them. Often when we'd spend 12 to 16 hours in a hotel room while she was blind, I'd wait on her hand and foot, and cock, during these times. They'd begin casually enough. She'd simply announce that she couldn't see, and that would go on until she'd just as quietly say she could see again. This happened while she was driving. I'd grab the wheel. While we were walking, I'd lead her. While we were loving, I'd finish anyhow. In fact, this happened any old place she felt like it happening. It was a great little game. She didn't have to worry if she smacked up the car or anything. The old lady would come to the rescue with lots of dough, wouldn't she? Oh, enough. Continuing then, from about 1,500 words ago, as to why Joan and I didn't live happily ever after. Very simple. We were given no chance. You see, as I drank the last Blood Brother beer, I remember deciding in all seriousness that it was definitely the last one. 2 plainclothesmen approached, asked if I was Neal C., and promptly hauled me away. It seems Cherry Mary's mother, listening on the phone extension to my friend give my whereabouts, had called the police. And she was politically powerful. Why, after release on statutory rape, with testifying flatly refused by Panicky Mary, and not a shred of evidence otherwise. Flatly panicky, I continued to be held in jail, charged with suspicion of burglary. Of my pool hall hangout, yet. Because the charge had a superficial plausibility, since I racked balls there a couple of times and knew the layout, I knew a lot of fearful moments before Captain of Dicks admitted he knew I was clear all along, released me finally weeks later. Joan had disappeared completely.